Please note, for maximum picture quality, it may be necessary to adjust the tracking control on your VCR.
After Star Wars was released in 1977, despite being a massive cultural success, there was a great fear that by the time a sequel would be released years later, it would have essentially faded from the public's mind. And so it was decided that the best course of action was to create a Thanksgiving special in 1978 to reinvigorate the public's interest in this beloved cast of characters. But we can't call it Thanksgiving because this is like a space franchise, right? What if we just call it something stupid, like Life Day? And thus, the greatest piece of Star Wars media of all time came into being.
The Star Wars Holiday Special.
The Star Wars Holiday Special tends to be a thing that people don't like, and for good reason. It's pretty unbearable. But one opinion that used to be really popular among fans was that because it was bad and because it was embarrassing, we needed to bury it in the sand and forget about it forever. And I just don't agree with that. Maybe it's because I'm a Doctor Who fan before I'm a Star Wars fan, and as a Doctor Who fan, I believe everything should be canon. There's a sliding scale in Doctor Who where the more that a piece of media is bad, or the more that a piece of media is weird, or the more that a piece of media is contradictory enough to bring up significant questions about the lore, the more I want the TV show to bring it up. And so for years, I've been excitedly waiting for Disney to get to the point where they were ready to start referencing holiday special content in their new material. In fact, the only reason I was excited to see Solo is because some of the early trailers implied that Mala was going to be in it, and I was so hyped to see that. I don't really like that movie. But you can, and that's totally fine. But this year, my hopes and dreams finally came true, as we saw the release of The Mandalorian. Do you get it? Legitimately, from the moment I started seeing preview materials, I was excited for The Mandalorian exclusively because I could tell it was artistically inspired by the holiday special. And when the episode came out, we got that great moment where a character references Life Day by name, and I was so happy! So, if a talented director recycling material from one of the worst pieces of Star Wars media ever made has created something so fantastic and so beloved, maybe it's about time we start looking back into the archives again to find other weird things that deserve being reintroduced to the community. Basically, today's video is going to be a little more lighthearted than some of my more recent ones, as I'm just going to, take sort of a step back, and we're going to be looking at some weird Star Wars pieces of media that most people have generally forgotten. I do want to say real quick, today's video is sponsored once again by Privacy.com, which you can go check out at Privacy.com/Quinton. We'll be talking a little bit more about those guys towards the end of the video, but with that out of the way, let's get into that wacky title sequence I'll probably come up with. The Star Wars media everyone forgot. It's pretty impossible to start talking about weird, obscure pieces of Star Wars media without discussing the original weird, obscure piece of Star Wars media. You see, when George Lucas was producing Star Wars, he became very convinced that it would be an ultimate flop. So he planned to justify the cost of materials and the actors' to film contracts by making a relatively low-budget sequel. He chose, strangely, to first have the story adapted into a book to publish shortly after the first film's release. When Star Wars proved to be a massive phenomenon, he cancelled all plans to film the original outline and started from scratch, eventually creating The Empire Strikes Back. And so, this little book ends up existing as a relic of a time and age where Star Wars was still trying to figure out exactly what it was about. Splinter of the Mind's Eye is notable for introducing a lot of stuff which is pretty synonymous today with what Star Wars is. For instance, there's a scene in the book where someone uses the Force to levitate an object off the ground, which, I know, total lore contradiction. You can't just make up force powers, people. You gotta stick to the pre-existing canon, which is exclusively episode 4. So in this scene, all of these characters are in a prison cell, and this woman is levitating a food tray, trying to press some sort of release button outside of the prison gates. And she's struggling because she barely is able to use the Force. And she says to Luke, "You have to help me, Luke, you have to help me." But he's never used the Force to levitate anything before. He didn't even know that was a thing. So he's concentrating, trying to help her, but he doesn't know what he's doing. And that's when we hear a voice speak inside Luke's mind. And if you know anything about the Star Wars canon, you realize that this voice has to be Obi-Wan Kenobi. "Don't try so hard, Luke," the voice said. "Remember how I taught you. Relax, relax. Let the Force work through you. Don't try to force the Force." That's the greatest Obi-Wan Kenobi quote I've ever read. So it gets a lot of things right. It also gets a lot of things wrong, and that's what makes it so funny to me. There's a scene in the book where Luke and Leia find a locked door. And they have to get inside there, and they have to do it quick, and they have to do it discreetly. So Luke begins fidgeting with his lightsaber, and eventually he figures out a way to unlock a setting that picks locks. Throughout the whole book, Luke and Leia are just constantly horny for each other. Pretty much every other chapter has some scene which indicates that while they're hanging out, at least one of them is thinking about going to Pound Town. In one chapter, Luke and Leia are stranded in a forest, and build a campfire to keep themselves warm and fall asleep leaning on one another. Later that night, Luke is the first to awaken and feels himself unable to avoid his attraction to the princess. He happened to glance down at his companion's face. It was not the face of a princess and a senator, or of a leader of the Rebel Alliance, but instead that of a chilled child. I think that is supposed to be a sexy description. Moistly parted in sleep, her lips seemed to beckon to him. He leaned closer, seeking refuge from the damp green and brown of the swamp in that hypnotic redness. He hesitated, pulled back. Oh, thank God. His assignment was to protect her. He wouldn't abuse that trust, no matter his own hopeless hopes. He would defend her from anything that leapt out of the darkness, crawled from the slime, dropped from the gnarled branches they walked under. He would do it out of respect and admiration, and possibly out of the most powerful of emotions, unrequited love. He would even defend her from himself, he determined tiredly. Is Obi-Wan like watching all this? You would expect him to chime in, you know, have a sort of a comment. Just trying to like cue Luke in. "Luke! Don't molest your sister in her sleep!" Throughout the whole book, Leia keeps having like PTSD flashbacks to when she was tortured in episode 4. But as the Empire gets closer and they realize that Vader is on the planet, Leia tells Luke that she refuses to ever be taken in by them again. And the two make a suicide pact. So Luke and Darth Vader get in a fight, Luke gets knocked to the side, I believe, and somehow Leia ends up with his lightsaber and prepares to fight Vader herself. "Leia, don't!" Luke yelled to her. "It's a feint! He's daring you! Kill me, then yourself!" And that is the greatest Luke line I've ever heard. Despite how weird this book is, it's really interesting to read it and think about how much of an influence it really has on the modern expanded canon. The few episodes I have seen of Star Wars Rebels seem to really be inspired by this book. In the book, they're trying to find the mythical Kyber crystal, which is supposed to be this big hunk of rock that makes one in tune with the Force and can also be used as a weapon or split off to be used to power lightsabers. And that, of course, has largely influenced the modern canon of the Kyber crystals. And that's going to be a big theme of this video. As we go through all these hokey adventures that just get stranger and stranger as we go along, they all still manage to have some role in later canons. There's this continuous cycle where Star Wars fans of the time will think that something is stupid, and then it gets wiped out by a new slate. And then modern Star Wars writers will immediately begin adding those things back in because their universe feels incomplete without it. As strange as the early books and comics of the time could be, I think the juiciest of obscure media in the galaxy far, far away actually came out in between 1983 and 1999, because this marked a unique period of time in the franchise where Star Wars was done. Today we think of Star Wars as ever-present and never-ending. You got your prequels, you got your sequels, you got your new TV show every few years that ties it all together. But in this strange 16-year gap between the original two trilogies, Star Wars was basically something that had no promised future. When the original Spaceballs came out, which is today a cult classic, it actually had horrible reviews, because a lot of critics argued that Star Wars was a cultural phenomenon which had come and gone. And that was only 4 years later. Within half a decade of the saga's end, people thought the franchise was just going to end up becoming a thing of the past. And thus, Star Wars at this point started to emulate culture as much as it had inspired it. One of Star Wars' biggest impacts on the entertainment of the 1980s was the invigoration of a relationship between toy markets and televised media, which led to the creation of shows made explicitly to sell merchandise. Key examples of these include He-Man, Transformers, and Thundercats, the latter of which included a knockoff of the Ewoks, except they were robots and they would stab people. So they were better. And so, 2 years after the end of the Star Wars film franchise, it started to make sense for this brand to break into this new market, which it had personally inspired. Thus, in the mid-1980s, Lucas created and premiered a series of 2 animated shows meant to appeal to fans who wanted to see their favorite franchise continue in animation. Out of these 2 shows, Droids is probably the one that I can most easily convince you guys to being something that's really cool. Here's why. One thing I can say that I don't like about a huge chunk of Star Wars spin-off material is that it's a little too obsessed with its own lore. Come in? John, miss. What the hell happened to you?
Some elves revived me as Christmas, John, miss. You hear that music around my head? It's like working retail, but it's always there, constant, 24/7, just the same 7 songs. And I can't get the taste of candy cane out of my mouth. Quinton, Robofan, all I want for Christmas is for you to blow my brains out, please!
I don't know, man. I feel like I've really moved past the whole shooting people in the face stage of my career.
Come on, man. Whatever. You're an asshole.
One thing that I would say that I really don't like about a huge chunk of Star Wars spin-off material is that it's a little too obsessed with its own lore. If I watch the cantina scene in episode 4, and I know every character's name, I know their explicit backstories, and I know how they in some way connect to 17 other characters in the original trilogy, then the scene is ruined for me. And I'm kind of tired of stories pulling out that same old card. Oh, this group that you're seeing right here, they actually become the rebellion. Oh, really? Along with the 17 other canon groups that also become the rebellion? I mean, don't get me wrong, I love myself some good continuity, but sometimes you just want to watch a story that is able to justify its own importance outside of being a setup to a different thing you've already seen. And I think that Droids does that well enough, even if it lacks a lot of the weight that you see in modern Star Wars shows.
The first episode of Droids starts with C-3PO and R2-D2 having just been ejected from the ship of their latest master. Apparently, said person had turned out to be a smuggler for a crime boss on the Outer Rim, and C-3PO had reacted by immediately calling the cops, leading to them being shoved out with all of the stolen cargo. The crashed droids are discovered by 2 men named Jord and Thal, who immediately are excited by the presence of an R2 unit, much to the annoyance of 3PO, who is stuck trying to convince them that as a protocol droid who speaks over 6 million languages, he is very valuable. After the boys take the droids in, we discover that they're very into racing. explaining their excitement in finding an R2 unit. But later that night, Jord is kidnapped by the son of the local crime boss, who wants to stop them from revealing the existence of their super weapon, which they plan to use to destroy all of the other crime lords, taking over their territory.
I am Tigfrum. I am of the new ways. Technology is the key to the power of the new From gang, not ancient blood ties and old world methods.
The characters show up to save their friend, one of them uses a lightsaber to get him out, and the droids escape with them in a spaceship, as they now realize that they have a chance to finally get to race. As you can tell just by that first episode, this show really is doing its own thing, and the droids really just happen to also be there. Just enough continuity is brought up to make sense, but the show generally avoids doing anything crazy out of fear that future films might contradict them if they try. This is successful to the extent that you'll generally find it hard to find any major issues within the show, and you can basically just watch it today and pretend that it's still canon. Droids is a rare example of what I like to call a Planet of the Week cartoon. Another similar show is Back to the Future, the animated series. Although obviously that's actually a time travel show, and so every episode is set in a different period and location on Earth, but you get my gist. The idea of a Planet of the Week show is that in every episode, the cast ends up in a different setting, with a different minor cast of characters, and in the case of droids, unique alien races. Shows like this are a lot less common because usually the cost of designing things like that are mostly spent during the first episode, and then said designs are reused throughout the whole show to save money. So The Simpsons only had to design a living room once. They only had to design a baby once. Droids, meanwhile, is exceptional for the time because it not only features a new planet every episode, but every few episodes, the droids will find new masters, meaning that 3PO and R2-D2 are the only characters who have appeared in every single episode. The show ends up having arcs. When you watch it in order, elements carry over from story to story, and thus it ends up being really satisfying if you can somehow find all of the episodes and put them in the right order.
Because of them, I lost my super weapon, the Trigon, the key to my takeover of every other gang in the galaxy. And now, all I have is this floating scrap heap.
I want to share with you guys another moment from this scene, because it's probably the best in the entire show. During this chase, the good guys jump into hyperspace, and the crime lord's son is all like, "We lost them, but we can make the jump to hyperspace." And the dad goes, "Can this rust bucket even do hyperspace?" And the son goes, "Of course it can do hyperspace." And then they jump into hyperspace backwards. I've never seen a piece of Star Wars media do that before. I can't wait for people in the comments to be all like, "Scientifically, that's not even how hyperspace would work. This show has a black woman. That's forced diversity." It's been said that every episode of Droids cost between $500,000 to $800,000 to produce. And that a lot of that said cost came from the excessive designing that had to be done for each and every story. Considering that's without inflation and that modern episodes of Rebels also cost around that much, it's no wonder that the show only lasted one season. But it's a commendable season at that. So as I said, the Droids cartoon is mostly standalone. But there are a few episodes we're talking about for people looking for greater continuity. For instance, in the episode The New King, one of the bad guys hires the bounty hunter IG-88. I think everyone remembers that old cantina head. And of course, much earlier in the season, our characters cross paths with the famous bounty hunter Boba Fett. Sort of. Boba Fett never actually encounters C-3PO or R2-D2. Instead, he is given his own droid who attempts to kill the main characters for him by disguising himself as an ally. Throughout the episode, whenever the droids leave the room, Fett will suddenly appear and will be recognized by the human characters. The obvious implication is that the writers were trying to maintain continuity to the 1978 holiday special, where R2-D2 and C-3PO fail to recognize Fett and believe his nature as a friend. This reminds me of how in Episode 3, Grievous speaks as if he's never met Anakin before, so the writers of the Clone Wars show had to go out of their way to make sure that those two characters were never in the same room. Except Droids, in this case, is using extreme writing gymnastics to avoid contradicting the Star Wars Holiday Special. Truly a show after my heart. But my favorite weird connection between the Droids cartoon and modern media is this guy, who is a recurring baddie in the show named Kybo Ren, a name which sounds shockingly similar to the main bad guy and sex symbol of the modern sequel films.
No one tricks Kybo Ren. Your rescue team has failed, Toda.
That was none of my doing.
According to what someone told me, George Lucas had a collection of random concepts and names that he gave to people looking to make more expanded Star Wars media, and what probably happened is that both the creators of Droids and J.J. Abrams pulled the name from the same list. But despite this, I still love the idea that in-universe, Snoke himself just stole this guy's name and gave it to Ben Solo. Like he couldn't even be bothered to think of a new name, he just stole someone else's name. For the longest time, Droids had some level of respect from the greater franchise's mythos. It seems to me that Lucas must have been especially proud of this series, and wanted to give it a greater representation than you would probably expect. The most obvious way this materializes is in the prequels. In each of the first 3 chronological Star Wars movies, Lucas makes at least one reference to the Droids cartoon. In the 4th episode of Droids, the cast goes to the planet Bunta and join into a race known as the Bunta Speeder Race. In The Phantom Menace, a sport known as pod racing is introduced, and the event Anakin enters is named the Bunta Eve Classic. In the 8th episode of Droids, we see the characters visit the swamp planet Bogdan. Alongside being mentioned in the original Star Tours, the moons of Bogdan are cited by Jango Fett as the place where he met Darth Tyrannosaurus Rex in Attack of the Clones. And in Revenge of the Sith, we see Grievous piloting a wheel bike, very similar to one seen in the Droids episode, The Lost Prince. Maybe that one's a coinkydink, no one can seem to agree. One small continuity issue is that when Droids was made, it was presumed that sometime after the narrative shown, they would meet Captain Antilles, the person who owns them in Episode 4. So the plot of the show is the pair aimlessly wandering around before this happens. But in Episode 3, we see the droids given to Antilles directly after the end of the Clone Wars, with 3PO's mind being totally wiped. For the longest time, the most popular theory often placed into Legends text was that the two were simply separated from their true master. They got lost, wandered around a bit, and sometime later they were found by Antilles and were reunited to the group. I do want to quickly note that there's also an episode of Star Wars Rebels entitled Droids in Distress that's clearly inspired by Droids, which I also like to squint at as I pretend that it's some bookend to the series. In it, the Rebels crew discover C-3PO and R2-D2 in the possession of yet another master, an Imperial minister looking to get her hands on a shipment of weapons. The two droids end up joining the Rebels crew as they escape, at which point C-3PO calls the cops, "What the fuck, C-3PO? Why do you keep doing this? When has it ever gone well for you?" Anyways, in the end, they get their droids back to their rightful owner, Bail Organa, who it turns out has actually sent them out on this mission to record and gather intel on the Empire from the inside. I kind of like to glean this to be a retcon, that the reason that the droids kept ending up within the earshot of so many crime lords and high-up Imperials and other threats in the galaxy within the droid show is that they were secretly being used as spies for Organa. R2-D2 would have known the whole time, kind of manipulating things because that's very in character for how he acts. But then they just wouldn't have told 3PO at first, leading him to believe he was actually lost because he's such a loudmouth that he would have given it away almost immediately. Or maybe it's just a charming old 80s cartoon and I'm trying too hard to make it fit into a modern collection of stories which tend to have totally different goals and intentions. But anyways, it's good. If you can find them on YouTube or something and you really want to put something on while you're working that's engaging without being distracting, I really recommend this show.
And Droid's sister show is, of course, Ewoks. I actually really like Ewoks. I thought it was going to have a bad time, but it was a really good experience, I felt. In fact, I would say I like it as much as I like Droids, if not a little bit more. Maybe just because it was the first one I watched, and I expected it to be this horrible experience, but it wasn't. And I feel like that's going to be a controversial take, at least partially because Droids is at least subservient to the idea of what the Star Wars Expanded Universe is supposed to be, and it's very similar to later Star Wars stories we would see, so people are going to be like comfortable with it as a piece of Star Wars media, and Ewoks just does its own thing, and I kind of respect that on an equal plane. And as a quick aside, I want to say, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but I actually hate the Ewoks in the movies. I have not recently been able to watch episode 6 without skipping some of those horrible Ewok scenes. So it's like a really big surprise that I liked the TV show for some reason. I'd like to stop really quickly and discuss the weird, inconsistent quality of the clips I've been showing, and also I want to defend the legacy of VHS. Ewoks and Droids both never had full home video releases. In the 1980s, a series of 4 VHS tapes were released, 2 for each show and 2 episodes per tape. Then, a little closer to the turn of the millennium, Lucas started editing more memorable episodes of these shows into movies, and then they released those movies, of which there were 4, on 2 DVDs. Almost any episode I show that hasn't been released on home video has almost certainly just been recorded off cable by some fan. And the thing about VHS is you had the option of recording in a speed that actually looked pretty good, but the thing is that it wouldn't give you a lot of tape space. For most tapes, it would give you about 2 hours, which wasn't a lot considering you had to buy the tapes individually. So most people would record in a setting called slow speed, which looked incredibly bad, but gave them 6 hours of tape instead. Also, there are other things to consider, like if the VCR you bought was kind of cheap and thus isn't very high quality and is never going to give you a good recording, or if the episode being aired on cable isn't being handled right and the audio is already messed up, and stuff like that. It's just a very variable, heavy system of archiving old TV shows. But with that said, the movie edits which we have on DVD and thus look really good, they often would be edited in a way that annoys me. So to make the episodes seem more like they were intended to be placed in one movie, they'll cut all the title cards, and more frustratingly, they'll often cut scenes at the ends of episodes if they hinder the ability to naturally flow from one story to the next. So if you're watching the DVD edit, there are scenes you're not being shown so that the movie will work better. So what I ended up doing was I took the 3 variations of quality and I combined them into one source so I could put title cards back in and restore deleted scenes. And I don't know why I did this, because it took like 2 days, and that wasted a lot of time in what is the most busy month of the year in my field. Okay, so I just want to show you guys an example of how annoyingly the film versions of these episodes are edited, and the things that I had to fix because of that. This is the start to Season 1, Episode 5, The Traveling Genders. I want you to watch this. You see, there's a hut, right? Then there's a title card. Then there's a bird. The bird flies in, it sits on that perch there, and it watches this girl play the flute. Okay, right? We're all on the same page, right? Okay, so here's the DVD edit of that. Okay, fades up, you see the hut? Cuts everything. Cuts everything. Why would they do that? I don't understand. I'm not exaggerating here. That pisses me off more than the Guido thing.
Ewoks is set some years before the events of Return of the Jedi, as we see the character Wicket coming of age as a young teenager. Around him are a cast of other vibrant characters who I could never tell you the names of even if I wanted to. In each episode, the cast faces a different threat from a recurring villain. For instance, in Episode 1, Morag the Tulog Witch, there are witches in the Star Wars universe, get over yourself, attempts to burn the forest on Endor to the ground by obtaining a local population of a fairy-like species and infecting them with a spark that ignites the trees on fire. Morag will often ask for help from a race of creatures known as the Duloks, who hate the Ewoks and fear the witch. I want to mention that the Duloks have become my personal favorite obscure Star Wars species. A fun fact is that they have a cameo appearance in the 2D Clone Wars shows as ambassadors to Endor. And more recently, one Dulok appeared in a canon Star Wars comic, which adopted many elements from the Ewoks live-action film series and cartoon into the new lineage, including cameos for the previously mentioned fairy species and the Duloks. But let me ask you this, comic writers. Why didn't you include this guy in your new comic canon? What about this bunch of guys? What about these boyos? What about... Every week in the show, a specific Ewok will become the focus, and a threat to the Ewoks will materialize. In one memorable story, Morag is planning on releasing a dragon that will ravage the forest if it sees a specific kind of tree. The Ewok's solution is to use a special kind of soap to make the trees invisible. The Duloks, trying to rid themselves of pests, steal the soap which causes this magic and discover its properties, and then attack the Ewoks while invisible. Some more stuff happens after that, but you kind of get the gist of the episode.
So, I can understand how Ewoks could seem a lot less interesting than droids, at least on a surface level, and how that would make some of you question why I like it so much. The main reason is this. I think that Ewoks is the perfect show to fall asleep to. And I can understand how that might sound like a backhanded insult, but I swear it's a massive compliment. The art of television you can fall asleep to is a subtly nuanced one. The reason you're putting something on to fall asleep to is because your mind is racing. You're thinking about the day, you're thinking about anxieties, you're thinking about some argument you were having with someone. And you want something that pulls you away from that you become invested in, but at the same time something that doesn't make you too emotionally invigorated. So it has to be television that's interesting, but television with relatively low stakes. And that's why I usually fall asleep watching The Office or Frasier, because those shows are always like, oh no, if we don't win, we're going to sell less paper, or we'll have to join a different wine club. And that's what Ewoks is to me. I mean, the art is soothing. The voice acting, surprisingly, I don't find annoying at all. The characters are interesting enough that I get sort of sucked into their antics. But the stakes are still stuff like, oh, we gotta save the Tree of Life from getting the world taken over by the Grinch. We gotta go through the maze of caverns and find the blueberry crystal. We gotta paint all the trees invisible, and there's a dragon, and... The only problem with it, and the only problem with Droids, is that the whole shows were never released on home video. So if you're gonna binge it, first of all you have to put it all together, and then you have to get used to that weird sudden shifting quality that can be really distracting. So I mentioned in my Discord server that I was working on this video and that I was kind of getting way too into this like teddy bear Star Wars TV show. And someone messaged me and was like, hey, can I send you like a birthday present? Because my birthday was earlier this month. And it arrived, and I was so blown away by what was in the package. You guys are going to love this. First of all, they sent me this piece of fan art, which is something else. But also inside was this. Oh my god, look at that. Isn't that crazy? Wow. So I've always thought about collecting animation cells. Specifically, I've always wanted like a Simpsons cell or a Sentinel cell or... maybe a Back to the Future cell, but I've never actually gone out and got my hands on one, and this is so nice. They said they bought this for $18, which seems really low for such a quality animation cell and a Star Wars cell, so I guess people just really don't care about the Ewoks cartoon. I'm trying to be really careful here, but I want to show you exactly what an animation cell is. So when they were animating the show, they hand drew and hand painted everything, and they put it on this little plastic sleeve. And I'll show you the back real quick. Trying to be really careful. Look at that. You see? Now you see that I think that's the paint layer. And so they would put it on, they'd swap it out from the previous frame, they'd take a photograph of it, and then they'd take this cell away. And this is a piece of historical media that existed for one frame and then existed in the real world outside of the show. And it's so fascinating to me. Literally, there's no piece of animation in the world that does stuff like this anymore. Even 2D animation is done on a computer now. And here we have a physical piece of history in the Star Wars continuum, even if it's the Ewoks cartoon. I actually went through the trouble of scrolling through every episode, and I figured out that this is from Season 2, Episode 2. The characters are looking at a baby, and one of them blinks, and that's where this frame is. And you don't even see the full thing. It's like cropped off. Isn't that nuts? So I'm thinking, if we as a community can buy like the rest of the 20,000 cells from this episode, we can individually photograph them and create an HD version of that episode of Ewoks. But still with VHS audio quality. So usually with videos like this one, I try to do them in 3 sections. So theoretically, the first section was when I talked about Splinter of the Mind's Eye. The second section was when I talked about these 2 cartoons. And the third section was a mystery segment I didn't have time to finish. I had this concept originally where I was going to talk about this weird line of Goosebumps knockoff novels that got made right before the prequels were announced. And I just think they're so, like, weird looking that I was basically going to, like, look at a couple of them and describe the plot and sort of joke about the covers, but I didn't have time to do that. If you guys want me to do, like, a standalone video about that closer to the end of the month, I could try to. If not, just go, like, watch some Goose Drunks. I was just going to knock off what she does. But since we were on the topic of Star Wars shows that are weird and obscure, I thought we could talk about the weirdest and the most obscure. The Star Wars show that doesn't exist. Woo! So from 2007 to 2010, Robot Chicken released a 3-part Star Wars film series. These films were my first Star Wars experience that I was really, really into, and I still consider them to easily be one of the top 10 pieces of Star Wars media ever made. Sometimes when I'm watching the movies, especially the prequels, a certain scene will just remind me of the Robot Chicken version of that, and it'll just ruin my attempt to watch the movie. I'll just start laughing. Anyway, so a couple years after they did that, Lucasfilm reached out to the writers of Robot Chicken and asked them if they would like to work on their own Star Wars comedy show. And so they wrote it, they voice acted in it, and they finished the episodes. But then something happened. Disney purchased the rights to Star Wars, and suddenly the show was no longer coming out. I can kind of see their perspective, because when Disney bought Star Wars, there was definitely this big anxiety among fans that they were going to cheapen the brand by releasing a bunch of low-quality tie-in crap, kind of like what they had done with the Disney princess movies in the 90s. And if this canceled show, Star Wars Detours, had been the first thing they had released, people would have been terrified, because it represents all of those fears down to a T. I just realized I haven't really played any footage yet. Here's some.
Yo, dudes, the Empire's pretty chill. Maybe you could, like, join it or something.
No, I left a message with your roommate, but your machine was full, so your landlord hung up on me when I was walking your dog because my homework ate it.
I got dressed for this?
Half dressed? Put some pants on, man.
Hey, so, how's my nose look?
Oh!
Detours!
Who should I take to the prom? Todd is totes double plus cute. No, Maya. My fake dad might approve of him. What about Kip? Yeah, I should totes date Kip. Kip's actually my boyfriend.
Cracknels for the ladies.
Awesome!
Why does this show look like Back at the Barnyard? The worst clip I've seen is this one, where Obi-Wan is trying to seduce this woman, and she looks like she belongs on the cover of a how-to-draw anime book.
Beep, 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 are you following me?
You're pulling me to you with the Force.
What?
Ooh, you don't even know you're doing it. Fancy. Now watch this marble. You're doing that.
But yeah, the point is that exists somewhere. It's finished, it's on a shelf, and Disney just isn't going to release it. Probably the only good thing about Disney's attempted vertical monopolization of the entertainment industry is that they do now have this platform where they can just sort of quietly put these things out without making a big deal about it. Like, what if you woke up one day and Star Wars Detours was just on Disney Plus, like in the Lego Star Wars section? I could see them doing that and maybe just restoring Ewoks and Droids and just like quietly putting it on there without telling anyone. Who knows, honestly? This video has no structure. Anyways, I want to stop real quick and thank today's sponsor, Privacy.com. You guys all know Privacy. They're the service that allows you to make proxy cards you can use to keep yourself secure online by not giving any place you visit direct access to your bank account. It's a brilliant little service that really helps you with security. But I'm also really excited to talk about two brand new services from Privacy, Pro and Team Accounts. With Privacy's Pro account, for only $10 a month, you get 1% back on all your purchases, and up to 36 cards a month. With Teams, you get, well, a team with a personal account manager, 60 cards per month, and personal limits structured to your business needs. But the regular version of Privacy is still totally free, giving you 12 cards a month to use any way you'd like, helping you stay secure online. And if you go to privacy.com/Quinton right now, you'll get $5 credited to your account. That's a free $5 you can spend anywhere you'd like online. So once again, that's privacy.com/Quinton. And I think I'm gonna need that $5 because this room has just spontaneously caught on fire. God damn it, how does this keep happening? Whatever, I guess I gotta move again. Jesus.